A fight to the death over one square. Okay, nobody died, but they really did want that one square. And they're two of the best players that have ever lived, Magnus Carlsen and Viswanathan Anand. This was in their World Championship match in 2013, game number 9. An unbelievably entertaining game. Lots of attacks, lots of back and forth. I think you're going to enjoy it. Anand has white, Carlsen has black. Let's jump right in. Anand begins with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, and bishop to b4. Magnus Carlsen plays the Nimzo Indian defense, and Anand plays f3, a very ambitious move. The idea is to play e4 and create a full pawn center and really go after the attack against black. d5 was played by Magnus. This helps control the e4 square and creates a stake in the center. And here, a3 was played by Anand. When you play this as white, you're not going to take any prisoners. What you're saying is basically is that I don't care about the damage to my pawn structure. I just want your bishop out of the way because I believe that my attack is going to be so ferocious that any pawn structure damage won't even matter by the end of the game. Bishop takes knight, pawn takes, and then c5. What Magnus wants to do is to exploit the fact that white hasn't developed a piece yet and create some chaos in the middle. Also, this square on e3 can be weak, and maybe he wants to strike in the center before Anand has done anything on that square. Pawn takes, and e3. Now this structure, let's get those off, right here in the center, is a very standard structure after white plays a3. And basically the strategy for white is very simple. White wants to play e4. If white can get in e4, white usually has a pretty big advantage. And the way he's going to do that, he wants to play bishop to d3, then knight g, e2, g3, where both pieces support, and e4 advance. So that explains Carlsen's next move. He plays c4, taking away the d3 square from Anand's bishop so it can't comfortably develop on that square. He does release the tension on the center, however. Knight to e2, continuing that plan of knight to g3 that we've talked about, knight c6. And here he plays an alternative idea that when e4 becomes hard, white will often play g4. Now, there's some risk. I mean, his king's stuck in the middle of the board, but he can still do a lot of damage on the king side here. And now he can play the bishop to g2 to support the e4 push, since it can't go to d3 anymore. Castles, bishop goes to g2, and now knight to a5. Aiming at this weak b3 square, it can land on that square, maybe cause some annoyance for white. Castles, now knight to b3, hitting the rook at a2, so a1, excuse me, so the rook goes to a2, and now b5. Magnus is following the very simple formula that you want to play on the side of the board where you have more space and where you have a potential advantage. And that, for him, is the queen side. It's a very sort of small segment of the board, but he does have an edge on the queen side. Knight to g3. Anand wants to play g5, kick that knight out, and he doesn't want the knight to be able to land on h5, so he puts the knight on g3 to help control that square. Also, this knight could hop into f5 if he wants. Magnus continues on the queen side, and now g5, kicks the knight away, the knight goes to e8, and now not only can that knight not go to h5, it now is no longer restricting the e4 push from white. It no longer controls that square, so Anand plays the move he'd wanted to play from the very beginning, e4. Now, the question is Magnus going to be able to deal with this e4 move? Usually when white gets e4 in these lines, he just has an edge. The first thing Magnus does is he grabs that bishop at c1. Now that that e-pawn has moved out of the way, that bishop had a lot more mobility. So he gets that out of the way. First, queen takes. He wants to stay defending this pawn, of course. And rook to a6, which is a powerful defensive concept. You see these in other lines, King's Indians and so forth. Basically, he wants to patrol his own third rank and use this rook as a potential defensive piece, but it can also go to b6 and support a b4 push at some point. e5. Now, normally in this structure, if white can get in e5, he's just winning. I mean, it's crushing. However, black has a possible saving grace here, and that is that he controls these light squares, his e6 and f5, these light squares. And normally you'd want to prevent white from getting this pawn, all the way to f5. But the control of these light squares may give him a chance to defend against Anand's attack. We shall see. Knight to c7, f4, aiming for f5 and f6. And White's attack is incredibly dangerous. Carlsen continues on the side of the board where he does have play. He plays b4, ab4, ab4. Rook takes a6, knight takes a6. So Anand has even gotten Carlsen's knight all the way to the other side of the board. He's gotten rid of that powerful defensive rook on a6. White's doing well, and now he gets f5 in. It's much better than cb4, then knight takes b4, then knight can come to d3, cause some irritation. Anand plays f5. Now this is a very impressive array on the king side. These three pawns and all of his pieces are over here. The queen can come over in one move. b3. So at the very least, Carlsen has this pawn protected on the third rank. So if the attack doesn't work out for Anand, Carlsen should have a pretty easy go of it on the queen side. The queen moves to f4, moving into attacking position. The queen would maybe like to go to h4. You can go to a lot of different places still at this point. Carlsen brings the knight back to c7. And I think the idea is he knows that Anand wants to attack this g7 square. When you're attacking on the king side, you find the square with the least amount of defense. And in this case, this g7 square is the most vulnerable. Also because Carlsen has a light squared bishop, making it harder for him to defend that square. So the most natural move is going to be f6. And that is what Anand does. Now, h4, holding steady, would have also been quite strong. But he plays f6, and now a bishop or knight can hop into this e6 square. g6 is played, and Anand's attack is very simple. And this is the one square I was talking about, this g7 square. If he can put this queen on that square, then it's checkmate, unless the square is defended. And it's going to be very tough for Carlsen to do that. Carlsen has to defend g7 with all his might. Anand is going to attack it with all of his might. First, he plays queen to h4 with a very simple idea of h6, g7. Now, Carlsen could have played the knight to e6. That does defend the g7 square. The problem is after queen h6, Carlsen can play bishop h3 and threaten to take the knight off the board, leaving g7 undefended. And so what Carlsen does very smartly is he plays the knight to e8. So he's still defending the g7 square, but it's very hard for White to get the knight off of the board. So it's in a very strong defensive place, but it is passive, and this rook at f8 is kind of stuck. But Anand plays the queen to h6. Now he's one move away from mate. If he can just get access to that g7 square, he's got mate. b2. So Carlsen is saying, okay, now I'm going to march this pawn forward and queen. And Anand makes a calculation. He says, I'm going to let you queen that pawn because my attack is so ferocious. Even down a queen, you can't stop it. So he plays the rook to f4 with the simple idea of switching the target from g7 to the h7 pawn. Rook h4, queen h7, mate. Very hard to stop. So what Magnus does is this. He plays b1, promote to a queen with check. So now Magnus is up a whole queen, but can he stop this mating process? Well, the first thing Anand has to do is deal with the check. Now, if he plays bishop to f1, it's very hard to see how black can stop it, but he does have a maneuver, and that's queen to d1, a very hard maneuver to find. Then if Anand plays rook to h4, he would play queen to h5. Now remember, he's already up a whole queen, so he can sacrifice this queen to stop the mate because he still has his original queen. And in this case, knight takes queen, pawn takes, rook takes, and this bishop can just go to f5. And the knight at e8 defends g7, the bishop at f5 defends h7. And in that particular scenario, it'd actually be an equal position because black couldn't move any of his pieces out of the defensive place, and white couldn't move any of his pieces out of their attacking place, and he would just have a standstill, and you'd have an equal position in that case. Anand, knowing this, and says, instead of that, I'm going to play the knight back to f1. And now, queen to d1 does not work, because rook h4, and if the queen goes to h5, he takes it, but that allows the knight in. the knight has access to this d5 pawn and maybe even later the f5 square. If the bishop defends d5, then bishop takes, and when it retakes, knight to f5, and white would just win. The threat of knight to e7 check would be devastating. The queen would have to take the knight, and when the pawn retook, then the pawn would be able to capture the rook at f8, and white would be better. But, as it turns out, Carlsen does not have to play queen to d1. Instead, he plays the more powerful queen to e1, a shocking move. And then when Anand plays rook to h4 to shift the attack towards h7, what does he do? What does Carlsen do? That's right. Queen takes h4, queen takes h4, and now he doesn't have access to f5 because the pawn is still on g6. And after queen to a5 attacking c3, the game is over. Carlsen has successfully defended g7 and won against one of the most vicious attacking players in chess history. An amazing performance. Even after going over this great game from Magnus Carlsen, there's still some great chess you're missing out on. Be sure to check that out in this next video right here. See some amazing chess. See you soon. Bye.